We are back at DSO Live, and I'm once again joined by my friend, former assistant conductor of the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, Charles Greenwell.
Good to be back.
Thank you. And we now come to the landmark of landmarks of French orchestral music, the Symphonie Fantastique by Hector Berlioz. No discussion of this work would be complete if we did not discuss the woman who was in many ways its inspiration, the Irish actress Harriet Smithson. Who was Harriet Smithson?
She was an actress very popular in London in the 1820s when she was in her 20s.
Right.
She was apparently extraordinarily beautiful, had this kind of stage presence that you just could not take your eyes off of her when she was on stage because she had such almost a hypnotic way, the way Sarah Bernhardt did later on.
Right, right.
Well, Berlioz went to see some productions of Shakespeare.
Now, this was Shakespeare in English, because if I remember correctly...
No, it was... Oh, yeah, Shakespeare in English.
Right, because
yes.
she didn't speak a word of French at that time, but it was
No.
all in English
And the
on
thing
the Paris
is,
stage.
Berlioz hardly spoke a word of English.
Of course, yeah.
But somehow he was able to figure out what Shakespeare was saying.
Yes,
But
amazing.
it would take too long to recall what he said about what he first saw Smithson. But I mean, he just fell head over heels infatuated with her, and in effect decided that she was going to be his some way or another. So he wrote the Fantastic Symphony. It was given its world premiere in 1830. She had no idea what it was about. She wasn't even there. And it gets so complicated, but he decided to revise the work in 1832. She happened to be in Paris at the time, and she saw this, and she, in effect, said, "Good heavens, was this piece written about me? Maybe I should go hear it."
Maybe I should show up, see what all the fuss is about.
She went to hear it and was really quite taken with it, flattered, and here these two people, Smithson hardly speaking a word of French, and Berlioz hardly speaking a word of English.
And yet somehow they communicated.
Somehow they communicated, and Berlioz went after her, and they were married.
Ah, yes.
Unfortunately, the marriage turned out to be a total disaster.
Right, right.
And the thing was, she suffered a number of reverses in her life. Her career went downhill. She was injured in an accident and became crippled. Berlioz stayed by her until the very end.
And that's what we forget about Berlioz.
Yeah.
I mean, kind of the opposite of Beethoven, the firebrand on stage, but a very warm human being in his personal life. And,
Oh yes, that he certainly was. And he said long after she had died that the impression that she had made on him and what they had shared together, no matter how awful it might have been, left an indelible mark on his personality.
Now, the other question I must ask you is the lore of the Symphonie Fantastique, as described in the program, is that this is 5 episodes from the life of an artist, and this sequence of musical dreams is in part inspired by the artist taking opium. I have to ask, did Berlioz himself take opium?
Yes, he did.
Ah, okay.
His father was a physician, a very eminent physician, who not only used opium himself, but prescribed it for many of his patients. What you have to remember about opium is that the way it was used in the 19th century, when it was called laudanum, is not the way we know it now.
Right.
Laudanum was, in effect, a concoction of opium dissolved in alcohol, and as one writer so beautifully put it, to the 19th century, laudanum was like aspirin to the 20th century.
Right.
It was used all the time. So he did use it,
Yes.
but to say that he wrote the symphony under its influence is maybe not exactly correct. But when it comes to the 4th movement, and then it talks about how the artist portrayed in the symphony wanted to kill himself, so he overdosed on opium, but he didn't overdose enough.
Right.
And it just sent him into this fantastical world in which he created these images and these phenomenal ideas and sequences that only Berlioz could come up with.
So as Leonard Bernstein immortally remarked, the trip in the Symphonie Fantastique is ultimately the music, the experience of the music, and the life of the artist.
Yes, and he also said that the Fantastic Symphony was the first musical piece of psychedelic influence. And indeed it was.
Indeed it
and when
was,
you
yeah.
consider that the original version of this, the first performance, was given 3 years after Beethoven died.
Indeed, just 3 years.
You just wonder where this man's mind came from.
And as Meister Slacken said last night, it really has nothing to do with Beethoven. And it's ultimately Berlioz's utterly original creation.
Oh, yes. Oh,
which
for
is
sure.
why, I mean, we forget how, but we've been reminded this week about how Berlioz really is just one of the greatest cultural figures of the 19th century, full stop.
And he did love Beethoven.
Oh, he worshipped Beethoven.
Oh, very much.
Indeed.
But the idea that you take his Opus 1, which is a concert overture, and already in this piece, there are these extraordinary musical ideas and the way of using instruments,
Truly
and you
amazing.
think that was just born in him.
Indeed
Yeah.
it was. Well, now this is a symphony in 5 movements, not
Yes.
4. We've talked about the penultimate movement, the March to the Scaffold, but then we will have the second movement is the ball scene, the waltz,
Yes.
where Meister Slacken has reinstated the cornet part Berlioz wrote for Jean-Baptiste Arbin, this virtuoso cornetist of the day, and then just the last movement is something I think ultimately beyond words. But Charles, in our few seconds remaining, of course, the Detroit Symphony has a great history with this piece going back to Paul Paré, its legendary maestro of the 1950s,
sure.
and its own recordings. It must be wonderful for you to hear the DSO again in this piece.
Oh, yes, and you know one interesting thing about those recordings, there are critics today who still think that some of those French recordings the DSO made with Paré are benchmark recordings and probably will never be bettered.
Indeed they are. Charles, it's been great discussing this music again
And
with you.
good to see you again,
Thank you.
Alex.
Thank you, sir.